This is the only video you need to pass your exams on Macbeth, because we are going to cover it all from the plot to context, characters, themes, and more. Take lots of notes and keep an eye out for key quotes throughout the video. And if you want the best grades, watch until the end for some secret weapons to help you ace your exams. Let's get started with a 1-minute recap of the plot. After a heroic victory in battle, Macbeth meets 3 witches who predict that he will become the King of Scotland. Encouraged by their words and his manipulative wife, Macbeth murders King Duncan and takes the throne for himself. But his guilt and paranoia quickly consume him, and spurred on by more prophecies from the witches, he becomes a tyrant, ordering more killings to keep his power, including his friend Banquo and the family of his rival Macduff. As Macbeth is haunted by his sins, Macduff joins with Duncan's son Malcolm to overthrow him, while Lady Macbeth's guilt drives her mad, and she takes her own life. In a final battle, Malcolm's army defeats Macbeth, who realizes too late that the witches had tricked him into believing that he was safe. With the tyrant dead, Malcolm becomes king and restores order to Scotland once again. But to really understand Macbeth, we need to look at the historical context, because it heavily influenced both Shakespeare and his audience. In the early 1600s, James I was King of England, and claimed to be a descendant of Banquo, the historical figure that this character is based on. He was also Shakespeare's patron, so it makes sense that this play was partly written to appease him. For instance, it was common belief that kings were chosen to rule by God, a principle known as divine right. So when Macbeth kills Duncan, it is portrayed as a crime against heaven that actually upsets the balance of nature. This was especially relevant to remind audiences of, because just 1 year before Macbeth was first performed, Guy Fawkes and a group of conspirators had tried to blow up Parliament and kill the king in the infamous Gunpowder Plot. Even the presence of the witches and supernatural in this play were drawing from popular culture, as in the 1600s, witches were seriously feared. King James I actually wrote a book called Demonology on how to identify and punish witches, which people found very unsettling because they were women. In those days, there were very strict gender roles that prevented women from having any sort of power or agency over their own lives. It was believed that women were supposed to be soft and innocent, so anyone who went against these traits were accused of being unnatural. Just like women, men also had gender expectations of violence and cruelty, but as you'll see later on, many of these roles are twisted in the play, which raises some very interesting questions on what it means to be a woman or a man. And speaking of men, let's look at the main man himself, the title figure and tragic hero, Macbeth. You might automatically associate Macbeth with being a murderer and a tyrant, but there's much more to him than that. Like all of Shakespeare's tragic heroes, he starts off noble and respected, but is brought down by his fatal flaw, which in his case is ambition. So let's find out how his character transforms from brave Macbeth to dead butcher. When we first hear about Macbeth, he's described as a war hero. The captain calls him Brave Macbeth. Well, he deserves that name. And the king refers to him as valiant cousin, worthy gentleman. But everything changes when Macbeth meets the witches, who prophesy that he will be king hereafter. Instead of being happy, however, his friend Banquo says that he seems to fear their words. And this is because their prophecy has just brought his deepest, darkest desires to light. Macbeth is afraid of his own ambition, and for good reason. However, his self-proclaimed vaulting ambition is balanced at first by his pesky conscience, which sets off a massive inner conflict that is visible to the audience through his many soliloquies. This is done on purpose, to let us see that he is a three-dimensional character with humanity, guilt, and fear, not just a ruthless, cold-blooded murderer. And when he does finally commit the act, he is immediately overwhelmed by regret and paranoia, saying, "I am afraid to think what I have done. Look on it again, I dare not." This isn't due to cowardice, because we know that he is a brave soldier, who earlier cut the king's enemy in two from the nave to the chops and fixed his head upon our battlements. Rather, it's because he knows that what he has done is really wrong, not just because Duncan is an innocent sleeping guest, but because of the principle of divine right that I mentioned earlier. He has just defied both God and nature, so it's no wonder that it weighs heavy on him. But after he becomes king and gets all that power he has always dreamed of, he now has to face the paranoia of losing it. He says, "To be thus is nothing but to be safely thus." and with one heinous crime behind him, it becomes easier to do it over and over again, ordering the murders of Banquo and Macduff's family. This signals the start of his transformation into a tyrant. He can no longer blame his wife for his ruthless behavior, and even admits that he is in blood stepped in so far that to go back now would be just as hard as moving forward. By the end of the play, he has changed completely and seems weary of life. He's almost indifferent to the news of his wife's suicide, saying, "She should have died hereafter," and goes on to essentially say that life is meaningless, a walking shadow. However, we are able to see a glimpse of the man he once was in the final battle with Macduff, where he refuses to surrender and goes out on his own terms, crying out, "Lay on, Macduff, and damned be him that first cries, 'Hold, enough!'" This return to bravery, even in defeat, is tragic because it reminds us that Macbeth wasn't always a murderer. He was a man who could have been great, but allowed his ambition to destroy him. But Macbeth is not alone in his downfall. His wife was just as implicit in the murder of King Duncan, and some would argue, even more. Let's move on to Lady Macbeth, one of Shakespeare's most fascinating female characters. At the time this play was written, it was very unusual for female characters to be so layered and complex, and even more unusual to have the traits that Lady Macbeth does. When we first meet her, she appears strong, ruthless, in control, more ambitious even than her husband. She reacts to Macbeth's letter about his meeting with the witches by saying that he is too full of the milk of human kindness to do what needs to be done. Therefore, she takes it upon herself to manipulate and push him towards murder by summoning spirits to unsex me here and fill her with direst cruelty. By asking to be unsexed, she is ridding herself of all the stereotypical feminine traits so that she can become a ruthless killer. This suggests, however, that she doesn't naturally have cruel and ruthless tendencies, since she has to ask the spirits to fill her with it, which implies from the start that her iron will and cold exterior might be all an act. As planned, she manipulates Macbeth by mocking his indecisiveness and questioning his manhood, saying, "When you durst do it, then you were a man." She is clearly the mastermind as she plans the murders, covers for him, and even frames the guards with the bloody daggers when Macbeth cannot. She has gotten her hands dirty as well, but confidently tells Macbeth, "A little water clears us of this deed," which is quite ironic considering what happens later. And when Macduff discovers Duncan's body, it is Lady Macbeth who diverts attention from her husband by fainting, playing into the stereotypical view of women being unable to stomach acts of violence. As the play progresses, however, hints of doubt start to show when she is alone, saying, "Naught's had, all's spent, where our desire is got without content." But she quickly snaps back to playing the perfect hostess at Macbeth's coronation banquet, until Banquo's ghost appears, and she has to viciously tell off Macbeth for being so visibly frightened by hissing, "Are you a man?" We could see her anger as pure disgust for his weakness, but remember, this is the last scene she appears in before her mental breakdown, so it is more likely that her anger is coming from a place of fear and guilt instead. Even more telling is her last line of the scene, "You lack the season of all natures, sleep," which foreshadows what is to come. The next and last time we see her, she is a sleepwalking, tortured woman on the brink of mental collapse. She hallucinates blood on her hands that she cannot wash off, crying out, "Out, damned spot, out, I say! Here's the smell of the blood still!" This drastic change reveals how much guilt and fear she has suppressed throughout the play, which is now manifested through insomnia and visions of blood. She has suffered all the same emotions as Macbeth, but because she has not expressed them, they now overwhelm her, leading to her taking her own life shortly after. Lady Macbeth can seem to be a contradictory character, appearing cold and calculating, but actually very vulnerable and emotional inside. She manipulates Macbeth by accusing him of weakness, but is guilty of the same thing herself. She wants desperately to have the stereotypical male traits of violence and ruthlessness, but cannot cope with the consequences of this behavior. Due to the gender roles of the time, it is likely that her character is written as a cautionary figure for women. She may have reminded the audience of the real-life witches who were being executed for having so-called unnatural traits. But in the present day, it is easier to sympathize with Lady Macbeth, who saw an opportunity to have some real power in a society which repressed and degraded women. But due to her destructive tendencies and lack of morals to balance her ambition, she triggers her own downfall. The sequence of events in Macbeth allows us to compare the two main characters. Their relationship starts off strong, with Macbeth calling her "my dearest partner of greatness," which was unusual in a society that degraded women, and confiding in her his deepest, darkest secrets. While he is hesitant and indecisive at first, she is ruthless and powerful, pushing him to take the plunge into murder. Afterwards, though, their roles gradually change, and it is Macbeth who becomes more and more ruthless, while Lady Macbeth declines mentally. He stops involving her in his choices and actions, as she is not aware that he is planning to kill Banquo or Macduff's family before he does it. Eventually, they become totally isolated from one another, to the point where Lady Macbeth dies alone off stage, and Macbeth is practically indifferent to it. But now that we've looked at the two villains of the play, let's examine some characters who made the right choices, starting with Macbeth's friend and fellow captain, Banquo. He is introduced at the same time as Macbeth, with both men being described as brave and heroic in their recent battle. He is also with Macbeth when he meets the witches, and receives a prophecy of his own, that his descendants will be kings. Unlike Macbeth, however, he is immediately suspicious, warning, "The instruments of darkness tell us truths, to betray us in deepest consequence." The difference in their reactions reveals that Banquo is a foil to Macbeth, or a character who has contrasting traits and values. This is why the two men are often seen together, because his virtues make Macbeth's flaws extra visible. He represents the path Macbeth could have taken if he had chosen honor over ambition. But this doesn't mean Banquo is a perfect, unambitionless angel. After Macbeth kills Duncan and fulfills his prophecy, Banquo questions, "It was said that myself should be the root and father of many kings. May they not be my oracles as well and set me up in hope?" He can see the temptation of giving in to his ambition and dark side, but he seems unable to cross that moral boundary of turning his thoughts into action. In the end, Macbeth has him killed for his prophecy, and also because he knows too much, as Banquo rightly suspects his friend played most foully to get his power. But even in death, Banquo makes one more appearance by haunting Macbeth at his coronation feast. It is interesting that it is Banquo and not Duncan who haunts him, even though both were innocent victims. This may be because of how similar they started off, and so by killing Banquo, he has also killed off the brave and noble person he used to be. Since Banquo doesn't make it very far, however, there is another foil in this play, the man who is seemingly destined from birth to kill Macbeth. Although he is not in the first part of the play at all, Macduff is a big part of the plot, and is the first one to discover King Duncan's body. His reaction reveals how loyal a subject he is, as he cries out, "Oh, horror, horror, horror! Murder and treason!" Macbeth tries to match Macduff's real grief, but this only highlights his insincerity to the audience. He is suspicious of Macbeth from the start, and is the only one to question him about why he killed the guards, so clearly he is not naive, or afraid to stand up for what is right. And this is why he soon takes up with Duncan's son Malcolm, who has fled to England. Macduff is passionately loyal to his country, and to the principle of divine right, as he proclaims, "O Scotland, Scotland, O nation miserable, with an untitled tyrant bloody sceptred, when shalt thou see thy wholesome days again?" However, he puts his love for his country over everything, even the protection of his family, as in his absence they are all murdered by Macbeth's assassins. He has a raw, powerful reaction to this news, crying out, "All my pretty ones! Did you say all? Oh, hellkite! All?" Macduff is not afraid to show emotion, which contrasts the flawed version of masculinity shown by Macbeth and his wife. If you look at the words Macduff uses to describe Macbeth, they are usually related to hell and dark supernatural forces, which puts him in the role of the righteous and holy avenger. This is why he is the one who delivers the final blow instead of Malcolm, as he has been portrayed from the start as the champion of Scotland, a true patriot who's opposing the dastardly traitor. But even after fighting tooth and nail to get the throne back, Macduff has no ambitions to become king, and passes it on to its rightful heir, Malcolm. As King Duncan's son, Malcolm inherits the divine right to rule, but this does not mean he will automatically be a good king. He flees to England right after his father is murdered, not out of cowardice, but because he shrewdly realizes that he is next on the hit list. And from that experience, he quickly learns to only trust people who have proved their loyalty. Even Macduff gets put through a test at first, with Malcolm pretending that he is unfit to rule in order to judge his reaction. Over time, Malcolm becomes a confident leader, using Macduff's wisdom and experience to help him take back the throne. Unlike Macbeth, who uses murder to seize power unlawfully, Malcolm becomes king through justice and support from the people. He immediately restores order and rewards those who helped him, inviting everyone to his coronation to help heal the wounded nation. And now that we've analysed all the main characters, let's move on to the theme which affects nearly all of them: ambition. This theme is particularly important in Macbeth because it also happens to be his fatal flaw, or the character trait which leads to his downfall. He has had ambition from the start, but it is ignited by the witch's promise that he will sit on the throne. He says, "My thought, whose murder is yet but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man that function is smothered in surmise." Almost immediately, he jumps to murder, even though the witches have not said anything about it, so he has clearly thought about it before. When he writes to his wife about his encounter, she is quick to latch onto it, revealing her own ambitions for power. She says about him, "Art not without ambition, but without the illness should attend it." She knows he has always desired this, but until now he has not been able to cross his moral boundaries to achieve it. And her fears are justified, because Macbeth is very hesitant to actually commit the murder, admitting, "I have no spur to prick the sides of my intent, but only vaulting ambition, which o'erleaps itself and falls on the other." By comparing his ambition to riding a horse that jumps too far and collapses, he is admitting that he knows things will get out of control once he gives into it. But still, he is pushed into committing the murder without too much difficulty, and this step symbolizes him abandoning reason and allowing his ambition to consume him. It's not just the Macbeths who have ambition though, as even Banquo is tempted by his prophecy, admitting, "A heavy summons lies like lead upon me. Merciful powers, restrain in me the cursed thoughts that nature gives way to in repose." Despite his noble character, he too has a dark side, and we'll never know how far Banquo's cursed thoughts might have taken him if Macbeth had not acted first. This shows how the promise of power can affect even the noblest of minds, and reminds us that any of Duncan's captains may have made the same choices as Macbeth had they been promised something so tantalizing as the crown. It is only human to be ambitious, but Shakespeare is suggesting that it is uncontrolled ambition which is the real problem. And as we find out, Macbeth's uncontrolled ambition quickly escalates, leading to the further murders of Banquo and Macduff's family. He becomes much more ruthless and tyrannical, willing to sacrifice anyone to keep his power. So although the Macbeths achieve what they wanted, it comes at the cost of their happiness. By allowing their ambition to overrule their morality, their success is hollow, and is accompanied by an enormous sense of guilt, which ends up destroying both of them. From the moment he kills King Duncan, Macbeth is haunted by guilt, and this theme carries on through the rest of the play. Shakespeare uses blood as a motif to symbolize this emotion, just like how we use the term blood on your hands to mean you are guilty of some kind of crime. Sleep, or more precisely the lack of it, is another way this theme is represented, because it is often associated with innocence and peace. After the murder, Macbeth tells his wife about the drugged guards. One cried, "God bless us!" I could not say amen when they did say, "God bless us!" By killing the divinely appointed king, Macbeth knows he has gone against God and nature, and his guilt stops him from even saying the word amen, which would absolve him of his crime. He goes on to say, "I heard a voice cry, 'Sleep no more, Macbeth does murder sleep!' And sure enough, from then on, neither of them are able to sleep again. Killing Duncan and framing the guards leaves literal blood on both their hands, a clear symbol of their inner guilt. However, they have different reactions to it at first, with Macbeth crying out, "Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand?" Lady Macbeth, on the other hand, says the opposite. "A little water clears us of this deed." She doesn't seem to feel any guilt at all, and is outwardly cool and calm, but as we know, this is just an act. As the play goes on, Macbeth admits that he has had terrible dreams that shake us nightly. Even with his new power, he cannot sleep, and his guilt reaches peak levels when he sees the ghost of Banquo at his coronation feast. But over time, Macbeth seems to become more desensitized as he continues to do terrible things to keep his throne. This contrasts what happens to Lady Macbeth, who puts on a convincing show for most of the play, and then has a complete breakdown at the end. Her guilt finally breaks free, and she finally gives us the first real look at her emotions in her sleepwalking scene. "Out, damned spot! Out, I say! Who would have thought the old man to have had so much blood in him? The Thane of Fife had a wife. Where is she now? What, will these hands ne'er be clean? I tell you yet again, Banquo's buried, he cannot come out on his grave." She reveals here that she feels guilt, not just for King Duncan's murder, but also the murders of Banquo and Macduff's family, as he is the Thane of Fife. By convincing Macbeth to do the first murder, she knows she is guilty of all the others too, and the imaginary blood on her hands is proof of that. When she and Macbeth die, it is almost a mercy, and Shakespeare is warning the audience that the worst consequences of crimes like theirs are often mental rather than physical. But while guilt haunts the Macbeths from within, another force in the play has been manipulating them from the start. Shakespeare weaves the supernatural deeply into the plot of Macbeth, and even the opening lines in the play are given to the three witches. As we know, King James I and the general public were fascinated with all things supernatural, so Shakespeare was referencing popular culture by doing so. However, although people really believed in witches and ghosts, the supernatural aspects of this play are not shown to be absolute fact, so it is left up to us to decide how real they are. Banquo himself is immediately skeptical of the witches, asking, "Are ye fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly ye show?" He wisely does not trust them, and even Macbeth knows it is not smart to meddle with these dark forces, saying, "This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good." But he ends up overruling his reason to serve his ambition. Shakespeare portrays the witches as two-dimensionally cruel and wicked, and makes them act in stereotypically witchy ways, which shows how desperate Macbeth must be to rely on them so completely. Because he wants to believe what they say, he ignores all the red flags, and perhaps that is Shakespeare warning his audience not to let a fascination for the dark side outweigh your morals and sense. Like her husband, Lady Macbeth also seems to be attracted to evil supernatural powers, invoking spirits that tend on mortal thoughts. She goes one step further and actually asks these spirits to possess her and turn her into a ruthless killer, which would have been terrifying and shocking to the audience. But it is not just dark supernatural forces that are at play, as the good side, usually represented by Duncan or Macduff, are often mentioned in association with God and heaven. Macbeth says, "Duncan's virtues will plead like angels," while Macduff seeks help from God to defeat Macbeth, praying, "Gentle heavens, cut short all intermission, front to front bring thou this fiend of Scotland and myself." So Shakespeare uses the supernatural to define the morals of the characters, because even today, regardless of personal beliefs, we associate heaven with good and hell with bad. But if Macbeth was just being controlled by evil witches, was it really his fault that things turned out how they did? Let's move on to the next theme, fate versus free will, which is closely linked to the supernatural. This is one of the biggest questions in the play. Are our lives governed by fate, or can we create our own destiny? It might seem that Macbeth's story was guided by fate, but there are also many times that he takes matters into his own hands to achieve his goals. In fact, when we first hear of Macbeth, the messenger tells the king that he won the battle by disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, meaning that they seemed fated to lose, but Macbeth turned the tide through his bravery. He even gives fate a chance when it comes to the witch's prophecies, saying, "If chance will have me king, why, chance may crown me without my stir." But when Malcolm is named heir, he takes matters into his own hands and murders King Duncan. And if he really does believe in fate, it seems strange that he would try to go against it by murdering Banquo and his son Fleance to stop his prophecy coming true. He confusingly says, "Come fate into the list and champion me," even though he is actually fighting fate through his actions. In the end, Fleance escapes, which could be seen as proof that the witches are controlling destiny in some way. However, we never find out if Fleance or any of Banquo's descendants actually sit on the throne, so it is very possible that it's just Banquo's sacrifice that saves his son, not supernatural intervention. Of course, the biggest argument for fate are the three apparitions shown to Macbeth by the witches. First, to beware Macduff. Second, that no man born of woman can kill him. And third, that he cannot be defeated until Birnam Wood marches against him. Macbeth settles with killing Macduff's family for the first prophecy, and interprets the other two to mean that he is totally safe since they seem impossible. So he is shocked when they do come true in very anticlimactic ways. Malcolm's army holds tree branches in front of them, and Macduff was born by C-section. If this really was fate, Macbeth is the victim of a very cruel cosmic joke. But it is also likely that the witches just manipulate Macbeth under the guise of it being his fate. He may have even turned the tide of the battle once again, had he not been convinced that it was his destiny to lose it. He admits that Macduff's revelation has cowed my better part of man, so even though he goes out fighting, he has already been defeated inside. It's up to you whether you think fate or free will brought about Macbeth's end, but Shakespeare's own life seems to argue for free will. He was not born rich or formally educated, but became a leading playwright with a patronage from the king on the strength of his own hard work and intelligence. From this perspective, it's likely that Shakespeare is trying to show that every man is responsible for his own actions, and the consequences which follow. But in Macbeth, appearances can be deceiving, as right at the start of the play, the witches chant, "Fair is foul and foul is fair," which gives us an early warning that everything is not what it seems. Soon after, Macbeth says something very similar, "So foul and fair a day I have not seen," and this deja vu moment implies that he will be connected to the witches and their deceptions throughout the story. Macbeth and his wife often have to put on a show around other people to hide their true thoughts and intentions. Lady Macbeth even says, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." This is new for Macbeth, who is a soldier and has a face like a book, but it works because the king does not see through their act, calling their castle a pleasant seat, and Lady Macbeth fair and noble hostess. However, Duncan can be a bit naive, as he has a habit of appointing disloyal men to the Thane of Cawdor position. He says, "There's no art to find the mind's construction in the face," meaning that there's no way to tell what someone is really like just from the outside. This was very relevant in England because of the gunpowder plot, and the general public were very aware and concerned that outward loyalty could be just a show to hide your real treacherous intentions. However, the stress of hiding who they are becomes too much for the Macbeths to bear, and may explain the apparitions that haunt them both. Macbeth sees a bloody dagger on the way to murder King Duncan and asks, "Art thou sensible to feeling as to sight, or art thou but a dagger of the mind?" We don't know if this was a supernatural sign, or just a manifestation of his guilt and anxiety, but the visions don't end there, as he also sees Banquo's ghost later on. While people have different opinions on whether or not his ghost is real, Macbeth is the only one who sees it, so again, it could just be a result of his overwhelming guilt and lack of sleep. His mind can no longer tell the difference between truth and illusion, and his wife scolds him for it, saying, "This is the very painting of your fear. This is the air-drawn dagger which you said led you to Duncan." But ironically, she is the one at the end who is plagued by hallucinations of blood on her hands that can't be washed clean. Macbeth's rise to power may have been built on deception, but once he has the crown, it quickly becomes clear that he is not really cut out to be king. So what exactly makes a good king? Malcolm describes the king becoming graces as justice, verity, temperance, stableness, bounty, perseverance, mercy, lowliness, devotion, patience, courage, fortitude. This is a long list of virtues that would be difficult for anyone to live up to, but King Duncan embodies pretty much all of them. He takes his responsibility as the divinely appointed king seriously, and is referred to as sainted, gracious, and great king. Even Macbeth, who is plotting to kill him, has to admit that Duncan hath borne his faculties so meek, hath been so clear in his great office. His death causes an absolute uproar, and after discovering his body, Macduff cries out, "Most sacrilegious murder hath broke ope the Lord's anointed temple!" It is so shocking a crime that the natural world reacts as well in unnatural ways. We hear about horses eating each other, owls killing falcons, and the day turning dark as night. Macbeth's actions have thrown off the very balance of nature, bringing chaos to the land. And although he finally achieves his goal of becoming king, he turns out to be much less suited to it than Duncan. At the beginning of the play, he displays at least some of the king becoming graces, but as his ambition takes over, his good qualities disappear. Unlike King Duncan, his actions are purely selfish, not to benefit his country, and therefore he does not inspire love and loyalty from his subjects. It is said of him that those he commands move only in command, nothing in love. And in comparison to Duncan, Macbeth is rarely referred to as a king at all, but rather accursed, fiend of Scotland, devil, and most often, tyrant. Once Macbeth's reign of terror is over, however, a third king takes the throne, Malcolm. Although he is young, he seems to possess many of the qualities his father had, but is perhaps more shrewd when it comes to the people he trusts. Shakespeare compares the difference between good and bad kings to show how power can either be used to protect and serve, or control and destroy. But if you've noticed, most of the power in Macbeth is held by the male characters, and that is because power was very closely linked to gender in Shakespeare's time. Through this play, however, he explores questions of what it means to be a man, and seems to criticize how traditional gender roles are twisted to suit ambition, power, or control. Masculinity was often displayed through violence and stoicism, and those who don't conform to this image are labeled as cowards or have their manhood questioned. In fact, conversations about masculinity usually come up before acts of violence, and Lady Macbeth is particularly guilty of this, accusing Macbeth of cowardice in order to coerce him into killing Duncan. This is an easy way to manipulate him, because as a soldier he is used to being praised for his courage in battle. And with his wife saying she would kill her own child if she had promised to, he feels like he has to match her ruthlessness or risk looking weaker than her, which at that time would have been shameful. Even before Banquo's murder, Macbeth asks the assassins if they are ready to kill him, to which they simply respond, "We are men, my liege." This suggests that men are expected to kill with no remorse or hesitation in order to be worthy of the name. However, Macduff gives us a different view of masculinity when learning of his family's murder. As a young childless man, Malcolm rather ignorantly tells him to dispute it like a man, but he responds by saying, "I shall do so, but I must also feel it as a man." He seems to understand that expressing emotions is not a weakness, but an important aspect of masculinity. That being said, a few lines later he also exclaims, "Oh, I could play the woman with mine eyes and braggart with my tongue," which again links women with tears and weakness. Interestingly though, the main female characters in this play are just as capable of being cruel as the men, if not more so. This would make the audience automatically see them as villains and unnatural. Macbeth tells his wife, "Bring forth men children only, for thy undaunted mettle should compose nothing but males." Tenacity and ruthlessness were seen as ideal traits for men, but not attractive qualities for women. No matter how cruel Lady Macbeth of the Witches can be, however, none of them seem able to actually kill. Lady Macbeth claims she would have killed King Duncan herself, had he not resembled my father as he slept, which exposes her vulnerability. And one of the witches admits while tormenting one of her victims, "Though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest-tossed." She cannot actually sink the boat to kill him, which shows that while the women have cruel intentions, there is still an impression that only men are capable of violence and murder. This is an old-fashioned point of view, but the connection between masculinity and violence is at least portrayed as a destructive one that leads to war and chaos within Scotland. Shakespeare uses recurring images to build atmosphere and remind the audience of the play's main ideas. These are called motifs, and I've already talked about two of the most common ones, blood and sleep, in the guilt section of this video. But another important motif is darkness, which represents evil and covering up your sins. It is not a coincidence that all the bad things seem to happen at night, because as soon as he starts plotting Duncan's murder, Macbeth says, "Stars, hide your fires, let not light see my black and deep desires." His wife reacts similarly, saying, "Come thick night and pall thee in the dunnest smoke of hell." But later, when she has her mental breakdown, she insists that she has light near her at all times, because she is desperately clinging to any form of goodness to shield her from the dark and the evil actions she associates with it. So now that you know everything about Macbeth, here are my key tips to help you turn that knowledge into a good grade. This might sound obvious, but it's the #1 mistake students make. Whatever the question is, stay focused on it throughout your response. An easy way to keep track is by looping back to the question with every point you make. For example, if the question is, how is the theme of ambition presented in Macbeth? Don't just tell the story, keep circling back by using phrases like, "This shows Macbeth's ambition because," or "Shakespeare is warning us about ambition here by." One of the easiest ways to boost your grade is to talk about language and structure. By language, I mean the literary techniques and specific word choices Shakespeare uses to reveal emotions, highlight themes, and create dramatic tension. Look out for personification, metaphors, repetition, and euphemisms throughout the dialogue, as they are some of the most common literary techniques, and then show what effect they have. For instance, you might notice that many of the characters use euphemisms, or an indirect way of speaking, instead of saying the word murder, using phrases instead like the deed, it, the night's great business, etc. This suggests that they are trying to distance themselves from the act and their own guilt. The play is structured like a typical Shakespearean tragedy which follows the rise and fall of the tragic hero Macbeth. One of the best ways to track his character transformation throughout the plot is through his soliloquies, which give us an in-depth look at Macbeth's inner thoughts and motivations. However, it also has a circular structure because it starts and ends with a battle where a treacherous Thane of Cawdor is killed. This shows that the events have come full circle and that order has now been restored in Scotland. It is also very important to memorize the right quotes that can be used for a variety of situations. You can use the key quotes from this video, or check out my quotes video on Macbeth, which gives you 12 quotes to cover the main themes, characters, and plot points. And best of all, they are easy to memorize because it doesn't matter how good the quote is if you can't remember it when you need it. We've talked a lot about context in this video, and that's because it helps us understand the actions and motivations of the characters. Don't just blurt out a bunch of historical facts though, make sure to link it to the question. For example, you can use context to explain why Macbeth's treachery was relevant to a Shakespearean audience, why killing a king was such a big deal, or how the strict gender roles of the time made women with power seem unnatural. Another way to rack up those marks is to make connections between characters and scenes where relevant. For example, you can compare Macbeth's uncontrolled ambition to Banquo's ambition, which is tempered by loyalty and restraint, or show how Duncan's calm, virtuous leadership contrasts Macbeth's tyranny. By making these comparisons, you can show the examiner that you really understand the play and its message, but just make sure it's relevant to the question. And lastly, if you want to get the best grades, you need to go beyond surface level analysis and include some critical interpretations of characters and themes. I've discussed many of these in this revision video, like how Macbeth and Lady Macbeth are more than just two-dimensional villains, and how the women in this play are shown to be capable of cruelty, but not murder. So try to put a different spin on your analysis, and as long as you can back it up with evidence from the text, examiners will reward your originality and extra depth. Well, now you know all the basics to pass your exams on Macbeth, but if you want in-depth analyses on any of the characters or themes in this play to get those extra marks, they are linked below. Good luck, and I'll see you next time.